Hello, I'm Nathan Johanning, Extension Educator in Local Food Systems and Small Farms at the University of Illinois Extension. Today we're going to talk about integrated pest management and specifically weed management. First, to start, let's define what a weed is. I've given many different definitions here, but I think the first is most fitting with respect to crop production, which is a plant growing where it is not desired. So quite simply, any plant where you don't want it in your field is something we call a weed. Along with that, remember that even a volunteer vegetable plant, if it's not in the place where you planted it, could also be considered a weed. Today's objectives will be to understand the basic biology of weeds and how they grow, to learn some about different management tactics, and we'll briefly discuss some specific herbicides and their uses. And then overall, throughout the presentation, I want you to think about how you will manage weeds on your farm. There are many specific characteristics that we usually associate with weeds. First, they are able to germinate over a wide range of environments. Next, they also have seed dormancy and longevity in the soil. They have rapid growth and extensive seed production, and also effective seed dispersal. They're also competitive. Remember that there's no one out there weeding around the weeds. They have to naturally be able to fend for themselves, and also that they're somewhat tolerant to insects and diseases, as also there's no one spraying fungicides or insecticides or picking bugs off them. They have to be able to tolerate these on their own. So why are weeds important to us in crop production? Well, typically we think of them as having disadvantages, the first of which and most important being crop yield loss. Weeds are extremely competitive, and because of this they tend to outcompete our crop plants if not managed. Oftentimes they're even more injurious than insects or diseases when it comes to providing yield loss if not managed. They're also a host for disease and insect pests, and they reduce produce quality, such as in this picture that shows a potato tuber that has a yellow nutsedge that has rooted through the tuber, rendering it a cull. Also, weeds produce seeds for future generations of plants, and we call that the weed seed bank. Also, there's a cost associated with controlling weeds. That's a disadvantage. That's an additional input we have to put into the growing system. And then lastly, human health. So things such as poison ivy are an obvious one, but other weeds such as ragweed that gives off pollen and has influences for those that have allergies also have negative impacts on human health. So this picture shows what a pumpkin field can look like if weeds are left unmanaged and competing with the crop. And subsequently, this represents the type of harvest that you'll get from a field with that level of weed competition. On the other hand, this shows a picture of some pumpkin fields where weeds have been managed to the best of their ability. And then subsequently, this is the type of harvest and the volume of harvest that you'll get from that. So, which do you want on your farm? So despite all their disadvantages, there are some advantages to weeds, some towards crop production and some towards other things. They can reduce soil erosion, especially over the winter, and contribute to soil organic matter. Also, in some cases, they can be edible. You can see two pictures here on the side. We have both dandelion wine and also some pokeweed salad. So there are some edible examples. Some think they do have an aesthetic value in natural settings, and overall they do contribute to the global genetic diversity of plants. There are three main types of weeds: grasses, broadleaves, and sedges. It's very important to know the type of weed when making a management decision. The biggest confusion that can occur is between grasses and sedges. The way to determine the difference is that sedges usually have a very thick, glossy leaf and always at the base have a triangular stem, whereas most grasses always have a round or flat stem. We can also classify weeds by their life cycle. First, we have annual weeds. Those are weeds which complete their life cycle in one growing season. We further subdivide that into summer annuals, which are weeds that germinate in the spring and mature in the fall, growing throughout the summer. And we also have winter annuals, which typically germinate in the fall or early in the spring, and then they produce seed late spring and early summer. Next, we have biennial weeds. These are weeds that complete their life cycle in 2 growing seasons. Most commonly, these would be things that grow very small and low to the ground in a rosette form the first year, and then the second year they bolt and flower, which is when they're usually most noted. Below you can see some pictures of some common examples, such as wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace, thistles, and also common mullein. Last, we have perennial weeds. These are weeds that live for 2 or more years, and they're things such as dandelion, pokeweed, Johnson grass, and wild garlic. One thing that distinguishes perennials over many other types of weeds is that they very readily will come back from their root system from year to year. So because of that and their reoccurrence, they can be very difficult to control, especially in vegetable crop production systems. Weed identification is the key to a successful weed management program. Most herbicides only control certain or specific weeds, so it's very important to know the weed so you make an application that will be the most beneficial. And this is also important for mechanical and cultural control methods as well, as if you have a perennial weed, you would take a different approach to that than if you had an annual weed, and so on and so forth. Also, the more similar the crop and the weed, the more difficult it is to control. So that's another reason why weed identification is so important. It's much easier to control a grass weed in a broadleaf crop than it is to control it in a grass crop. The next 2 slides identify some commonly found weeds. Note that some weeds, such as the thistles and docks, are perennials, and some of those are very difficult to control. On this slide, you can see some winter annuals, such as the common chickweed and mouse-ear chickweed, and also to note purslane, which is very commonly found, especially in central and northern Illinois, in many high fertility fields. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through every weed you might find out in your fields, so we'll point you to some resources to help you identify them. First, we have some websites. The University of Missouri has a very good weed ID program online. Also, the USDA Plants Database online is a very good resource. Next, we have some printed resources. The Practical Weed Science for the Field Scout is a good field scouting guide for agronomic crops. However, you'll find it very useful also for horticultural crops. Additionally, 2 books that are pictured here, Weeds of the Northeast and also Weeds of the Midwestern United States and Central Canada. Both of these have lots of good color pictures and are great resources to help you identify weeds. Now that we have the weeds identified, we need to think about how to manage the weeds. The illustration below shows the life cycle of a weed, and the hammers represent a different point in time at which we can control or manage that weed. One thing to note is that as the weed produces seed, those seeds can then generate new plants in future years. So anything we can do that will prevent a plant from growing the seed will only help reduce the weed pressure in that given field. Also, whether you are in a conventional system or an organic system, the smaller the weed is, the easier it is to manage. And this is the same whether you have tillage as a tool, a herbicide, or anything else. The smaller it is, the easier it is to manage. Typically, we divide the methods of weed control up into four main categories. Cultural weed control is the management of the crop to make it more competitive with the weeds. Typically, this does not include the use of tillage and chemicals. Mechanical weed control is the use of physical forces to control weeds. This would be tillage, or also could be hand weeding. Chemical weed control is just the use of herbicides to manage weeds. And biological weed control is the use of natural enemies, insects, pathogens, or animals to control weeds or to reduce the weed seed bank. And overall, a successful weed control program will utilize as many of these methods as possible. There are many different cultural weed control methods you can use in fruit and vegetable production. Manipulation of planting date and also seeding rate and row spacing can help on weed control, and also cover crops. Pictured to the right, you see at the top a crimson clover cover crop, and then in the middle a red clover and oats cover crops that's still growing. Then below that you'll see a broccoli crop which has been no-till transplanted after a wheat cover crop which was terminated. Also, you can manage weeds through how you manage your fertility, irrigation, and crop rotation. Also, whenever you're planting, make sure you plant vigorously growing cultivars, those which will compete more quickly with weeds. Mulching is also important, which we'll talk about more, either organic or inorganic mulches. And then in general, integrated pest management itself is important, because if you manage insects and diseases and other factors, it will just promote the health of the crop and rapid growth to compete against weeds. As I mentioned, variety and hybrid selection is also very important. Different varieties can provide a different level of crop canopy, and this greatly changes their competitiveness with weeds. In this illustration here, we have some research that was done in sweet corn. You can see 3 different hybrids of sweet corn, and then the pictures below are the representative images looking up through the crop canopy. You can see a great difference in the amount of leaf coverage, and this can greatly influence the amount of weeds that are able to germinate and survive underneath the crop canopy. Here's some examples of different types of mulch. Here we can see we have bark mulch, the use of straw mulch, and also a fabric or plastic mulch, and this is all in black raspberry production. In addition to the mulches, here are some examples of cultivation used for weed control, and also as a reference we have a hand weeded control which is kept completely weed free. And then on the far right you can see what happens if you had used no weed control methods. Next we have mechanical weed control. This is very common in fruit and vegetable production systems, and most commonly we utilize tillage as a weed control method. This could either be pre-plant tillage or row cultivation after planting and crop emergence. Also involves hoeing and hand weeding, mowing, leaving ground lay fallow, the use of flaming or burning, and also the use of heat through steaming or solarization. And what this is basically the use of that heat to heat the soil to the point which it sterilizes seeds in the weed seed bank in the soil. Chemical weed control is the use of herbicides to either kill emerged weeds or to prevent them from germinating. Oftentimes this can be done with less labor than other management practices, and also it does not disrupt the soil, which can also be important. Now there's many herbicides on the market, but a limited number are labeled for many specialty crops. So why is this? One thing is due to the diversity of specialty crops. With this diversity of crops brings a diversity of challenges trying to ensure crop safety for all these different crops with a given herbicide. Also, they're high value crops, so should there be any injury, there's a lot of dollars at stake. Also, specialty crops are a smaller market share compared with agronomic crops. Herbicide clearance can be a major problem on these smaller acreage crops, as most products go on per acre, so obviously there's fewer acres used and fewer acres purchased of fruit and vegetable herbicides compared to grain production, so that makes the market less lucrative for companies. And either way, it still costs the same amount of money to clear herbicide for a vegetable crop as it does a grain crop. Lastly, we have biological weed control. Oftentimes, biological weed control is too specific to be effective in cultivated crops due to the difficulty of establishing natural enemies in a system with rotating crops and various activity in the field. It's more practical oftentimes in natural settings such as forest, rangelands, or prairies. Despite this, we can benefit from biological weed control through seed predation by rodents, insects, and pathogens which can deplete the weed seed bank in the soil. The photo to the right shows giant foxtail seed which has been left on the ground and fallen from the plant, and you can see if you look closely that most all the seed has been eaten or consumed by small insects or rodents. So therefore, those seeds which otherwise could germinate are now rendered sterile and no longer a threat to come up for future years. Timing of weed control is very important. There's multiple times throughout the growing season which you can choose to manage weeds. In this illustration, the inner yellow circle represents the life cycle of a crop, and the outer green circle represents the life cycle of a weed. And then the green dashed lines with the associated letters represent a different point in time which you can manage that weed. Those letters then refer to this table, and at each point you can see different potential sources of weed management benefits that may occur. These can be things such as seed decay, seed predation by either insects or rodents, seed aging and loss of germination, and then various other things such as contact with a herbicide, fatal germination, which could come from things such as germination prior to tillage or germination prior to a herbicide application. So there's various things that can reduce the number of weeds and the potential for weeds in your field, and there's various times of year which those occur. Some common weed control practices utilized in vegetables are tillage, which is very prevalent both as pre-plant tillage and also within row and between row cultivation. Mulches are used quite a bit, especially black plastic mulch along with other colors, utilized very much for summer annual vegetable production, and also straw and other organic mulches are utilized. And still hand hoeing and pulling of weeds is very prevalent, especially around plants and in areas where we can't get in with cultivation or other operations. Cover crops are also providing some benefit and gaining popularity, especially things such as cereal rye, which produce a large amount of biomass, are very good at suppressing weeds and providing residue which will prevent weeds from emerging through it. Herbicides also have their place and been utilized. We don't necessarily have herbicides that will provide weed control for every weed and every crop, but with combination of many of these others, herbicides can be very beneficial and reduce the labor needed to provide weed control. And also mowing can be utilized. Sometimes it's between rows, and also sometimes in asparagus production mowing can be used. Now in perennial fruit production, the most important thing you can do is to control and manage weeds ahead of planting, especially perennial weeds. So take an area that you're going to plant and make sure to manage those, whether it be with tillage or herbicides or any other way. Make sure to manage them and remove those perennials prior to planting, so you're not trying to deal with those in a perennial planted crop. And this is especially true because remember that crop that you plant is going to be in there for multiple years. You're not going to want to dig it up or replace it because you get a massive weed problem. Once established, oftentimes herbicides are utilized. Mowing is often very common between plants or vines or trees. In some cases, cover crops are utilized. In this instance, in the picture here, we have a cover crop that's planted within the grape rows to help suppress weeds. Also, oftentimes mulches are used. This is especially common in blueberries and in brambles, as the pictures of mulches showed earlier when we had the raspberry pictures. Now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about herbicides, both different herbicide types and how they're classified, and some specific examples of how they can be utilized. First, with herbicide types, some are classified by their movement within the plant. One such type is a contact herbicide. A contact herbicide does not move within the plant, and therefore it requires very good spray coverage, which is important for effectiveness, and is usually used at higher spray volumes, such as greater than 15 gallons per acre. Basically, a contact herbicide, wherever it hits on the leaf, it will react and maybe move slightly, but beyond that, it doesn't move down to the root system. However, a systemic herbicide is one that moves throughout the vascular system of the plant, and therefore it can be taken up by the leaves and moved down through the root. Coverage is not as important since it can move throughout the plant, and oftentimes it works well with lower spray volumes, so 15 gallons per acre or less. Another way we classify different types of herbicides is by selectivity, basically by saying what weeds they control. Non-selective herbicides broadly control most plant species. Some examples of this would be Roundup, Gramoxone, Liberty, or Horticultural Vinegar. Also, we have selective herbicides. These are herbicides that control only certain plant species. One example of this would be Select, which is a product that controls only grasses. Also, we have 2,4-D, which is a product that only controls broadleaves. There are also many different application timings for herbicides with respect to crop and plant development, so it's very important that you know and understand these. First, we have pre-plant incorporated. This means that you're applying before planting and it's worked into the soil, sometimes by tillage or sometimes by water. Next, we have pre-emergence. So this is a herbicide that is strictly applied before crop or weed emergence occurs. Next, we have post-emergence. This is a product that's applied after the crop and or weeds have emerged. And then next we have post-directed sprays. These are applications that are made after crop emergence, but the spray is directed away from the crop. And this is something you'll see very commonly in fruit and vegetable crops, as we have products that we can spray between the rows and effectively control weeds. However, if we would get them on the plant, that they would then injure the crop. Now let's talk about herbicide selection. So what are some things to consider when selecting a herbicide? Well, first, consider the crop rotation restrictions or carryover of that herbicide. Often you can find this information on the herbicide label, and typically we are more concerned with this whenever we have products that have soil residual activity. Pre-harvest interval is also something to consider. This is when you have a designated window between the time you apply a herbicide and when you can actually make a harvest. So make sure you plan ahead so that you don't have to push back harvest because of when you sprayed a given herbicide. And also the weed spectrum that you're trying to control. You want to make sure that the herbicide you're applying will actually be effective and control the weed or weeds that are most problematic. Another thing is make sure to rotate herbicide modes of action. Each herbicide has a little bit different mode of activity, and there's different groups of herbicides, and basically like we do with other pesticides, we want to make sure we don't continually use ones that act in the same fashion, or otherwise we can build up potential resistance to those herbicides, rendering them effectiveless. Also, consider your soil type and the amount of organic matter in your soil. As you consult the herbicide label, some herbicide rates will increase or decrease as the amount of organic matter increases. Also, consider rainfall amounts and distributions. It's very important to note if some herbicides need rainfall to activate them, and also note that some herbicides need a rain-free window to make sure they stay on the leaf long enough to actually have activity. Some herbicides are listed as restricted use pesticides, and these require you to obtain a pesticide applicator's license from the Illinois Department of Agriculture in order to use them and purchase them. Again, testing is once every 3 years, and there's a small fee for the license. You can easily find information for a testing site near you, generally in the spring or late winter of the year. And for most of you who are just making applications on your own fields for which you're growing on, you need to get the classification of a private applicator. Now let's talk about herbicide recommendations. These are just some general recommendations on a few selected herbicides just to give you a few ideas of how they work and how they can be utilized. Again, always read the label for specific rates and crops that they can be used on, and also note that there's a few organic herbicides that are available for organic producers. Again, always be mindful of potential carryover to future crops and the pre-harvest interval, so that way you can harvest crops timely and do not have to delay harvest due to a pre-harvest interval. The first herbicide we'll discuss is Roundup, or the active ingredient glyphosate. For all of these herbicides we'll talk about briefly, I'll list the trade name first, and then list the active ingredient name in parentheses behind it. The active ingredient name can be very helpful in case you encounter generics, just to compare what is actually in a given product, as trade names will change while the active ingredient may still be the same. So Roundup does provide non-selective weed control, meaning it controls a broad range of plants. It is systemic, therefore it will move from the leaves down into the root of plants and provide control. And because of this, it takes around 7 to 14 days visually to see control of plants. It has no residual activity and only affects plants that have emerged leaves at the time of application. It is good for many perennial weeds, especially grasses, since it is systemic and it will move down to the root system of plants. In vegetable crops, you can use it before planting or as a directed spray between crop rows. Do be precautious if you use it as a directed spray not to get any on any crop leaves. Since it is systemic, it can translocate through the plant and cause some injury to plants if you get a small amount on the leaves. It's registered on a wide range of fruits and vegetables. However, there are some issues with herbicide resistance, especially with weeds such as water hemp and mare's tail and some others depending on where you're at in the state. Next we have Gramoxone, or the active ingredient paraquat. Gramoxone is a non-selective herbicide controlling a broad range of weeds. Unlike Roundup, it is a contact herbicide that acts very quickly, often within 2 to 3 days, and sometimes you can see the start of initial injury within a few hours on a warm sunny day. It has no residual activity and only controls weeds that are emerged at the application, and it's fairly good on grass, but it works better on broadleaf weeds due to its contact nature and how the plants grow. It can cause some crop injury where it contacts crop leaves if you use it as a post-directed spray, but since it's a contact herbicide, it does not move systemically to injure the plants. Therefore, if you do get a small amount on a leaf, it will cause a small necrotic spot or dead spot on the leaf. However, the injury goes no further than that, and generally speaking, plants recover and show no signs of injury, even though a small amount may get on the leaf. It is a restricted use pesticide, so you will need a pesticide applicator's license to purchase it. And it has labeled uses in various vegetable crops, including potato, pumpkin, squash, pepper, tomato, sweet corn, asparagus, cabbage, and many perennial fruit crops in various ways, including ahead of planting and between crop rows, so consult the label for more details. Now we have two herbicides which are fairly similar in their activity. Select, which is clethodim, and Post, which is ethoxydim. Both of these are selective herbicides which control only grasses. They are systemic, so they do move from the leaves down to the root system of the plant. They have little, if any, soil residual activity, and they're labeled for use in most broadleaf crops for control of grasses. The pre-harvest interval varies, so make sure you watch. It can be anywhere from 1 to 60 days depending on the crop and the product you're utilizing. Generally speaking, these two herbicides are very similar in their activity. There are some differences, although they are in the same general herbicide family and mode of action. Generally speaking, Select is better on perennial grasses than what Post is. Next, we have II Magnum, or metolachlor. It also provides selective weed control for grasses and for small-seeded broadleaves. However, it strictly has soil residual activity and provides no foliar activity for controlling weeds. Therefore, it only controls seedlings that have not yet germinated or emerged. It's labeled for selected vegetable crops, including pumpkin, potato, tomato, sweet corn, and horseradish, among others. It does need rainfall to incorporate it into the soil for maximum effectiveness. Next, we have horticultural vinegar, or acetic acid. It is a certified organic herbicide for non-selective weed control. It is a contact product that's somewhat similar to Gramoxone in its activity. It has no soil residual. It does provide control of broadleaf weeds and suppression of most grasses. It does definitely work best on small weeds, and you do need higher concentrations, around a 20% solution of acetic acid for control. Now note, if you're in commercial production, household vinegar is not labeled for weed control, so make sure you utilize a product such as horticultural vinegar that is labeled specifically for use as a weed control compound. Herbicide application is very important, and oftentimes the effectiveness of a herbicide is directly related to how well it has been applied. So to start off with, know the rate per acre you desire to apply. Note that your rate per acre of herbicide times the number of acres, of course, equals the total amount of herbicide that you'll need for that given field. Make sure to calibrate the sprayer to know the output of the sprayer. Typically, we measure this in gallons per acre. And we'll discuss this more, but there are multiple fact sheets, two of which I have links to here in this presentation, that give you detailed instructions on sprayer calibration. But again, it's very important to know how many gallons per acre you're actually delivering to make sure that you're doing an accurate job and actually applying at the specific rate and not too low or too high. And also make sure to check the label for adjuvant recommendations. So adjuvants do not have any herbicidal properties, but they help the herbicide stick to the leaf, enter the leaf, and or spread on the leaf surface for better coverage. Oftentimes there are many herbicides that it's essential to get good efficacy to add an adjuvant, and without the adjuvant you'll be very disappointed in the level of control you get. Some examples of what adjuvants are would be a non-ionic surfactant, crop oil concentrate, or ammonium sulfate, all of which have different uses and properties to aid in the efficacy of herbicide applications. First of all, how do you figure out your spray volume, or how much water you need in the sprayer to cover a given area? Well, this first goes back to your sprayer calibration. So you need to know how many gallons per acre your sprayer puts out, and then you need to know how many acres it is that you need to spray. Therefore, if you had a sprayer that had 15 gallon per acre output and you had a 5-acre field to spray, you'd need 75 gallons total carrier volume to spray that field. Now if we move on, to a little different situation. Say you have an area that you need to spray that's 200 by 200 feet, or 40,000 square feet. You want to spray Roundup Power Max at 22 fluid ounces per acre, and the output of your sprayer is 15 gallons per acre. What do you need to do to figure out how much herbicide you need? Well, first of all, you need to figure out how much of an acre it is that you're spraying. So to do that, we know that an acre is equal to 43,560 square feet. And if you ever need to find this information, usually this is in the back of many of our pesticide management guides. So you can usually find conversions of information on this in them. So we know that we have 40,000 square feet. We divide that by the number of square feet in an acre, and that tells us that the area we're wanting to spray is around 9/10 of an acre. We then take that times the rate of application, which is 22 ounces of Roundup, and that tells us we need around 20 ounces of Roundup to cover that area. Likewise, we take our acreage times our spray output of 15 gallons per acre, and it should take us a little bit under 14 gallons of carrier volume to do this. Alright, for this example, we'll go back to our 5-acre area, and we're going to be spraying Gramoxone SL at 2 pints per acre. And we'll also be utilizing the adjuvant crop oil concentrate at 1% volume to volume, and note that this rate is based off of the total carrier volume, not off of a per acre basis. Next, we will have our spray volume, which will increase since it's a contact product up to 20 gallons per acre. So to figure out the amount of herbicide needed, we'll again take an acreage times the herbicide rate, giving us 10 pints of Gramoxone needed. For our carrier volume, again take the acreage times your spray volume, which will give you 100 gallons of carrier volume. And then since we have our carrier volume figured, then take that times the 1% rate of crop oil concentrate, giving us 1 gallon of crop oil concentrate needed for this application. Now we've given you a broad perspective of the different ways you can manage weeds on your small farm. So now what do you need to do? First, I would suggest starting off by creating a weed management plan. So how would you do this? First, identify your problematic weeds and where they're found. This is very important and can be something as simple as saying you have grasses versus broadleaves, or winter annuals versus summer annuals to start off with, just so that way you have a better idea of what's there. Then choose the methods of weed control you want to use. Notice I said methods, as we've said throughout this presentation, that you need to use multiple methods of weed control to be most effective. Then choose a control method that's appropriate for the weed and the cropping system. Make sure also, especially if it's relating to herbicides, that you consider any current or future crop rotations that might be going into that given field. And then lastly, and I think is probably some of the most important, is document what you have done and its effectiveness for reference for future years. The biggest thing you can do and best thing you can do is to know what's worked before and then utilize that, and also what hasn't worked before, so that the next year you know to try something new. In summary, weed competition can severely limit crop yield at any growth stage. So even weed competition early in the year, long before any fruits are set, can cause long-term damage to the yield potential of that crop over its livelihood. And the smaller the weed, the easier it is to manage. We can't stress that enough. And do not let weeds go to seed. Remember, we talked about it a little bit, but all those weed seeds in the soil are what we call a seed bank. So if you let a weed go to seed and it can produce potentially hundreds if not thousands of seeds, that's just that many more potential plants that you're going to have to manage. If you do manage weeds fairly well in a field over the course of time, you will actually see your weed pressure go down due to the fact that you don't have new weed seed production to replenish those weeds. But again, that's over the course of many, many years. Make sure you use multiple management strategies to have the most effective weed management plan. And there are limited herbicides available for fruit and vegetable crops, but do utilize those that are there. They can provide you help. And remember, if you are utilizing those, watch out for restrictions on future plantings, pre-harvest intervals, and to make sure to rotate different herbicide modes of action to prevent potential herbicide resistance. And then in the end, promote a healthy crop. If you can keep a crop clean of weeds while they are young, many crops can form a canopy and compete with weeds. And overall, the healthier the crop, the more they're going to be able to withstand any weeds that may be present. And last, we have some resources for you to help you with any weed management challenges you may encounter. First, we have the production guides for vegetable crops, tree fruits, and small fruits and grapes. So links are all there to those guides, and they all have herbicide recommendations in them, giving you further details on herbicides. Also, we have a good handout on dry pesticide rates for handheld sprayers. This is a very good publication which gives you detailed information on how to mix up small quantities of dry pesticides, and this goes for not only herbicides but also insecticides and fungicides. It can be very helpful, especially on small acreages, especially with these dry compounds, which are very hard to measure without a very good scale. Also, if you need to look up any product labels, there's two links here through cdms.net and greenbook.net that are great online resources that have very complete listings of herbicide labels that you can find, and also other pesticide labels that can be very useful when researching herbicides or finding out more information. And if you have more questions about herbicide mode of action, there's also a link to a guide from Penn State which explains and defines different herbicides and their modes of action. Thank you for your attention, and please feel free to contact any of us if you have further weed management questions.